Imagine that you wake up in the morning, grab yourself a cup of coffee, and you go to your first virtual meeting of the day. And you enter the meeting, and there's nobody there, except for one person, and that is the CEO of your brand, the brand you're working for. And he takes the opportunity to have a one-on-one conversation with you, and he or she is asking you the following questions. How do you think we can survive or thrive during this crisis? In other words, how do we make sure that we are still relevant when this whole thing is over? Will everything change or not? Now, these are very big questions. And at TrendsActive, the consultancy where I work, we've been thinking about this a lot. And the reason for that is because we work for the biggest brands in the globe, and they are walking around with these kind of questions. And I don't know about you, what you guys think, but we believe that the right guidance, the right way to respond on this crisis, to find the right strategies, we first need to understand the effects of Corona on the changing needs, values, and behavior of people. Because in the end, that decides where this whole thing will go. And we've been part of meetings, sitting in Zoom or Teams or whatever, and what you hear a lot is the question, how long does this stay? When is it all about to end? And actually nobody knows. Because in the end, it depends on whether we have a vaccine or not. It depends on whether we create some sort of group immunity. It depends on many circumstances. So we don't know how long this will stay. But what we do know is that in the end, it's human needs that influence how this crisis will unfold. It's human needs that decide whether we end up in an economic crisis and how long that will stay. It's human needs that determine whether people will keep on buying stuff or not. It's human needs that, in the end, decide where this all goes. So that's the first starting point where we have to look at if we want to build strategies. And that's something that we've specialized in for almost 2 decades. We use 2 big buckets of inspiration, sources of insight, to inform us on how to create strategies. And the first bucket is the field of the human sciences. Think of sociology, anthropology, psychology, because these are fields of science that are really good in understanding human needs and how that evolves. And the second big bucket of inspiration and insight is sociocultural trend research. And by combining the two, we can really find the right insights to inform us on the right strategies to tackle this whole Corona crisis. And I'd like to talk about both of them. But before I'm going to get scientific, I want to start with a little story about something that happened almost 500 years ago. In 1569, a person named Willem Barents embarked on a journey. And together with 20 of his crew members, he was about to discover a northern route towards China. Because back in the days, there was a lot of trade between Europe and China, and the Portuguese people were becoming very rich in this trade. And the Dutch, they thought, okay, we have to find our own innovation, our new business model. Let's try and find a northern route. But as you probably know, if you go north and you use the northern seas, it gets freezing cold up there. You have to pass alongside Siberia and Russia. So in the winter, we have temperatures of -20 and -40. So they decided to leave the country in August, when it's still summer here in the northern hemispheres. And around September, October, they got caught up in meters of ice. And that's one of the first lockdowns we can find in the human history. These people had to suffer from social isolation. And we are remarkably well informed about how people behave in such a circumstance. There was one of those crew members who kept a diary. And in this diary, we can read a lot about how people behave. So what happened, the first thing they did was to find some sort of security. They felt really uncertain about the things that were going on. Meters of ice around them, freezing cold, and big threats of polar bears. So how do you protect yourself from polar bears? How do you make sure that you survive the cold? They started to build a house called Het Behouden Huis. And they still have a couple of those archaeological artifacts here in the Rijksmuseum in Amsterdam. And they tried to protect themselves and find some security for all the uncertainty that was coming towards them. And the second thing was that they were socially isolated. And it's pretty dark up there in the north in the winter. So it was cold and it was dark. And they were just sitting there with the same 20 people. They didn't have Zoom. They didn't have Netflix. They didn't have any apps to find your friends and start drinking. But what they did was they had a campfire. So what they did is they used their wine, they baked pancakes, and once in a while they had a little party. And if you make a comparison between that moment in history 500 years ago and today, you see a lot of parallels. And although it's not very scientific yet, it's not a coincidence that people behave in the same way. Now, if we take it from a more scientific perspective, like I said, the first source of insight and inspiration, we see that there is a lot of debate about what is going to change and not. And you probably also had the same experience when you start Googling on how to respond to Corona, or when you're going through your LinkedIn stream. There is a lot of advice out there. All kinds of gurus that will tell you that everything will completely change and all kinds of new behaviors will pop up. Well, there is another part of science, the more academic fields, that say that deep down, the human being is quite the same. And if you look at the anatomy of how the human behavior is influenced, there is a lot to say about that. Almost on the surface, we have the behavior. That's the visible part of what we do. And the behavior is influenced by intentions, and these intentions are influenced by deeper underlying values and needs. And these drive the behavior that we see. So what we often see is the new signals and manifestations of behavior that finds its origin in deeper underlying needs. Now, these deeper underlying needs, they don't change that fast. The manifestation of behavior, that does change, of course. But the deeper underlying needs don't. You probably all, so we went into that research, trying to find what other scientists, what academics have told us and learn what they can learn us about a crisis. And you know, that whole Corona thing is not the first crisis that we have experienced as human beings. There have been multiple crises before. Humanitarian crisis, health crisis, economic crisis. So there is a lot of science and a lot of research done on how people behave in times of crisis. And there are actually two main key factors that influence people right now. One is uncertainty. Will I keep my job? Is my family still safe? Will I be able to protect myself? Am I still healthy? So what you see happening is that all kinds of brands, customers of ours as well, start to provide stability and security, which is a very good strategy. For example, here in the Netherlands, Bavaria, it's part of the Swinkels family. It's a brewer, and they usually brew beer, but now they create hand sanitizers. And we're one of the first beer brands that is walking that path of creating stability and security. Hugo Boss, another client of ours, they are now have transformed their production facilities to creating face masks. And it's a good strategy because we know from science that people are pretty uncertain in these times of crisis. And the second thing that is really popping up is the fact that we feel socially isolated. Now, deep down, human beings are social animals. We depend on the group. We are group animals. We need to survive in groups. We are nothing without a group. And that's just not something from the past. It's something that have over 200,000 years of evolution that has grown upon us. So it feels very uncomfortable for people to be socially isolated. There are psychologists that have measured that actually loneliness is more dangerous than, for example, smoking. We also know from scientific research that the people that get the oldest in the world are the ones that have very strong relationships with the ones that they love. It's a research from Harvard. We also know from psychology, for example, from Daniel Kahneman, one of the Nobel Prize winners, and Richard Taylor, that in the end we all sort of behave on system 1 and system 2 thinking. And system 1, the majority of our behavior, is influenced by system 1, and that is the unconscious behavior. So what we often see is the tip of the iceberg of behavior, and that is changing, but everything down there is not changing that fast. So what we do at TrendsActive is we are trying to uncover those deeper underlying needs and see what the effect is of a crisis on that behavior. And what we now see and have identified is a couple of those human needs and behaviors that are amplified or accelerated during times of crisis. And it's a great source of inspiration for strategy makers, because in the end you want to build a strategy on things that are quite stable, not on all the things that change very rapidly. Now, of course, on the surface, again, you probably watch more Netflix than you did before Corona. You might do more online groceries before Corona, and you all definitely need a haircut, and luckily enough the hairdressers are open again. So of course there is some behavior that we can see, but deep down there we are still human beings that have been evolving over 200,000 years and kind of behave the same. So what we did is we dived into that, and actually that's not something completely new for us. We've been doing that for about 20 years. And we do that with sociocultural trend research. Now, I just explained you the anatomy of human behavior, but let me tell you a bit about how the anatomy of trends, how that works. On the most intangible level, we have macro trends. These are global forces, global shifts and developments in society that as an organization or as a brand, you cannot influence them. Think of a climate change. Think of a financial crisis. Think of polarization in politics. These are big shifts in society that are just out there. They determine the world that we are operating in as a brand, but we cannot influence them. So what we do at TrendsActive, and what we believe that you should do as an organization or as a brand or as a talent or as a senior or whatever, is try to understand the effects of these kind of trends on the behavior of people. What is changing in times of climate change, in times of an economic crisis? Because that's something you can adapt to. Now, on the most tangible level of trends, there are product and market trends. These are trends that come in the form and shape of a product. Think of vegetarian shoes or vegetarian meat. Think of products like the grooming products. And now that the barbershops are closed, we see a rise of grooming products or people trying to do their own haircut. Or market trends. Everyone in retail is chasing the same subscription-based e-commerce business model. Everybody working in insurance or in banking is trying to explore what robo-advice is doing, and they're trying to experiment with chatbots. So what you often see is that many organizations and brands are pretty aware of what is going on in their market. And they just follow or copy-paste what their competitor is doing or what their startup is doing. Now, we know from marketing science that that's quite a good business model, to be a follower and not the first mover. However, it's not always original. What we believe is that you should try and look for your own brand values and then decide, based on what the human behavior is that drives the adoption of all those trends, how you would fit in. And that's what we do. We try to contextualize, we try to explain, we try to unravel why these product and market trends appear. So why is it that subscription-based e-commerce is going up in times of crisis? Why is it that people are really longing for a good holiday in times of a crisis? What's the effect of Zooming the whole day and sitting in virtual meetings the whole day? How does that affect human beings? That's what we try to uncover, and we believe that that's a great source for strategy making. Now, we have 10 trends at TrendsActive, and they're divided into 3 big groups. On the left, you see societal trends. These are trends that affect all of us. So no matter whether you are rich or poor, live in the countryside or in the city, if you're a man, a woman, young or old, we are all living in times of societal change. We are all, especially now in times of crisis, facing a shift in trust. Who can we trust and who not? Do we trust the politics? Do we trust our neighbors? Do we trust people to keep 1.5 meters of distance? There are gender trends that talk about how men and women and their traditional roles in the household, how that is changing. Men of today also have the right for 2 eyebrows. They use day creams. They start cleaning. They have a daddy day and take care of the kids and do all kinds of more female things of the past are becoming more male-oriented nowadays. And we look at generations. So why is it that millennials and Generation Z still hit the parks when the sun is shining, whereas we have this 1.5 meter distant policy? These are very interesting questions, and we've been researching that for quite a while. Now, the same thing with Corona is now applied on our model. So we looked at what's the effect of Corona as a macro trend, a global force that we cannot influence. What's the effect on people? Because if we understand that, we can try to adapt according to our brand values. And we look at all these product and market trends. Why is it that people buy so much toilet paper? Why is it that you probably have all kinds of beans or rice or pasta in your drawers? Why is it that the Americans buy guns when a lockdown is introduced? Why is that? What is happening there? That's very interesting to unravel. So over the past, 4 or 5 weeks, we have been reading thousands of pages of research from all kinds of more popular publications. So from McKinsey, from Kantar, from GfK, from Ipsos, from all kinds of consultancies and research agencies. And we've contextualized that with insights from the human science and plotted that on our trends. And what you then see happening is that a couple of those fundamental human needs, a couple of those changing needs and values, in other words, a couple of those social cultural trends become even more relevant in times of crisis. Now, to explain all these trends would be very difficult because that will probably take me about a week. And we have about 10 minutes left, so I'd like to tap into one of those. But just to give you an overview, on the left you see shifts in trust. What we see, for example, is that people really long for local and authentic brands nowadays. They demand purposeful actions from companies to create that stability, to provide them that bit of security and to take away a bit of that uncertainty. In gender trends, we see that women tend to be a bit more affected than men. Not physically, there are more men dying than women, but more mentally. We also see that there are differences between how generations cope with a crisis like this. And depending on the values of a generation, depending on the way you've been raised and the society that you're growing up in, you are influenced by today's crisis. We, for example, especially worry about the effects on the younger generations nowadays, because we see there's a lot of effect on their changing needs and behaviors. And in the middle, you see the search for meaning. And that is something you probably all have experienced. Even before Corona, people were in search for more meaning in life. And why is that? Because in the end, that is life, right? The sole purpose of life is to become happy and to live a meaningful life. And there is actually a distinction between happiness and meaningfulness. Happiness is a bit more derived from the Greek word hedonia. So you want to sometimes have a hedonistic experience, like drinking a lot or going to a party, something like that. That could make you feel happy, but it's often on a short term. The other part of being happy and living a meaningful life is meaningfulness. And what you see is that what's really joyful for people is to engage in meaningful experiences. So for example, visiting your grandma, making a phone call or writing a handwritten letter to someone that you really like, helping people in need, going out in nature to feel you're part of something bigger than just yourself. And we've been researching this trend for about 10 years. And just before Corona hit our society, we updated the whole research on this trend because we believed it was one of the trends that was more relevant than ever. And now that Corona is hitting our society, it turns out that it's even more relevant than what it used to be. Because lots of our search for meaning is changing now. Big things about our search for meaning are changing now. And the reason for that is that we all of a sudden come in sort of a reflection mode. People start to realize, is this it? Why did I always work so much? Why can I live a less stressful life? What a beautiful thing to sit around the kitchen table each and every day to have lunch with my kids now that they're not going to school and I'm not allowed to go to work. So people really experience what it is to find meaning in life. And I'd like to talk about one of our insights and translate that in a strategy because I believe it helps brands to adapt to the current situation and to find that human-centric response to everything that is going on. Mental well-being. We know from research that if you want to make the most of life, if you want to make a meaningful life, if you want to live a meaningful life, you need your brains. You need to be mentally okay. If you suffer from a depression or a burnout, it's hard to live a meaningful life. If you have certain dreams in life, you probably need your mental capital in order to engage in those meaningful things. But that mental well-being is under pressure. If you look at the figures, it's pretty alarming. The World Health Organization, for example, they expect that depression will be #1 disease in society in 2030. That's about 10 years from now. 1 in 5 everywhere, no matter whether that is in the Netherlands or in other countries, about 1 in 5 people is suffering from a stress-related complaint. Could be a burnout, could be anxiety, something like that. And you probably all know someone that is suffering from a burnout, and maybe you've even experienced it yourself. So these are pretty alarming facts. You see that there is some pressure on our mental well-being. And on the other hand, sociologists tell us that we live in a performance society. And now that you're scrolling through your live stream, you see all the beautiful lives of other people, you know that you can achieve all those opportunities in life. You can have the biggest ambitions that you want, and we all want to do something great in life. The performance society has an effect on us. But that also gives a certain pressure. And there is a plus and a minus about mental well-being. The minus is that we should avoid from walking into the mental illness. The plus is that we need our mental capacity to maximize our full potential and to make the most of life. And this is researched a lot by many psychologists, psychiatrists, sociologists. And I'd like to refer to 2 just to make my point a bit stronger. There is a guy named Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi. It's an Hungarian gentleman, and he invented the concept of flow. And you probably all use the word flow once in a while. You know, I really in my flow, in my work or in my sports. And flow is a state of mind that really gives you, it's kind of an optimal experience that you can achieve as a human being. And it happens when you're doing something that is really challenging, but where you have enough skills to pursue that challenge. Then you enter a state of flow. And Csikszentmihalyi, together with Mr. Martin Seligman, they invented the school of the positive psychology. It's a new angle in psychology, and they say, well, we could better prevent people from getting mentally ill instead of curing them once they are already ill. And what they also found out is that to look at one's happiness is that much of our happiness we are very much responsible for our own happiness. About 40% of our happiness depends on the activities that we engage in. Only 10% of our happiness and the meaningfulness that we achieve in life depends on our DNA and the place where we grow up. So if you grow up in Zimbabwe compared to, for example, Amsterdam, there might be differences in how much happiness or meaningfulness you can achieve in life, but it's only for 10%. 50% is for your genetics. I mentioned DNA before, but 50% is DNA and genetics. So some people tend to be a bit more positive than negative. We also know that the people that have a more positive mindset are also better capable of managing a flu, for example. It might even be a cure for corona, who knows. But 40% of the activities of you and me, of everybody here in this room, for 40%, our happiness depends on the activities that we engage in. And that's a great opportunity. It's a great call for marketing people because we can be part of those activities. What is your brand? What is your customer experience? What is your digital activity adding to the meaningfulness and the activities that engage people in a meaningful life? How do you add to that? What's your role in that? And that brings us to the strategy. So the trend here is that people suffer from mental well-being, or that mental well-being is under pressure. That is not just happening now, but it is accelerated in times of Corona. It was there before, and it will stay there after Corona. So what's the strategy that you should engage in? It's to improve that people's mental resilience. How do you make sure that people are mentally resilient today? You can do that by either acknowledging that this is going on, or by really engaging in those activities that help people to create that mental resilience. Let me show you a couple of examples of brands that do that in a beautiful way. And we've mentioned a couple already, but for example, the travel industry. The whole reason that probably the travel industry will see a great uplift, might even do better than before, and then I mean consumer traveling, not business traveling, is probably has to do with this trend, that people are suffering from this mental pressure and they want to go out again. They want to experience what it is to live in in other cultures, to sit with their family in a tent watching a mountain or whatever. If you look at the whole subscription-based e-commerce industry, you all have ordered your food online. And probably lots of that has to do with the fact that it's pretty stressful to go to the grocery store nowadays. Will that stay afterwards? Might be a little bit, but it will probably drop also a little bit. Now let's look at a couple of other examples. The First Direct is a bank from the UK, and they have been running a program called Money Wellness. And what they do is they sell mortgages and saving accounts and all kinds of financial products. But what they found out, and we know that from research as well, is that people can suffer from financial stress. And now that we are in Corona, financial stress and financial anxiety is on the rise. Because people are not sure whether they can be able to hold their job, whether they are able to still pay their mortgage. So they now have a 24/7 hotline and a whole website and all kinds of customer experiences and digital journeys that allows people to get more information on how to become mentally resilient from a money perspective. Great initiative because it really taps into their changing needs and behavior. But it could also be very small. For example, BettyBot. She's a chatbot and she is answering questions around Corona. Very simple questions that can help you to ease a bit of the mental stress you might have now that you're living in Corona times. And the third example that I'd like to close off with comes from Headspace. And we know that Headspace is the most popular mindfulness app. What you can do is you can get guided meditations and as such lower that pressure on your mental well-being and maybe try to find more meaningfulness in life, get into a flow, get more focus, all these kind of things. And usually you have to pay for a subscription on Headspace. But what they did now is they opened up a couple of programs that are free at disposal of anyone that wants to improve that mental well-being. And it's a great initiative because it matches, it fits with a changing human need. Now we covered one of the trends out of our trend model. And it shows that if you take a deep dive into changing human behavior and you try to distill trends that might have started before Corona and will evolve during Corona, but also will stay after Corona, that you really have some sort of stability on which you can build a strategy. It's much easier to build a strategy on long-term trends, on things that don't change or slightly change, than on all the things that are changing rapidly. Now in 1569, Willem Barents and his agile multidisciplinary team of 20 people went on a journey to find a new innovation, a new business model. And they didn't succeed. As a matter of fact, Willem Barents himself, he died. Some people got back, they learned a lot about their failures, and hopefully you as an organization, as a manager, working for a brand, hopefully you will not die during this crisis, but you have the right insights now to equip yourself to either survive or maybe even better, to thrive in times of crisis. Thank you very much.